The ballroom of the historic Georgetown mansion buzzed with the murmur of conversation, the clinking of glasses, and the calculated laughter of Washington's elite. It was one of those evenings where political allegiances were masked by pleasantries, where alliances were forged over expensive scotch, and where influence carried more weight than conviction. J.D. Vance stood near the marble fireplace, listening politely as a donor recounted a well-worn anecdote about his family's legacy. He nodded in all the right places, offered a knowing smile, but his mind was elsewhere, calculating, assessing, always aware of the eyes that followed him. As one of the fastest rising names in conservative politics, he had become accustomed to the expectations of these gatherings. Every handshake carried an agenda, every introduction held the potential for leverage. But then, the atmosphere shifted. A name floated through the air, Alex Carter. The journalist's reputation preceded him. Known for his sharp wit and incisive political critiques, Alex had built a career on holding power to account. He was unafraid to ask the questions others avoided, to expose hypocrisy where he found it, and to do so with a charm that made it impossible to dismiss him outright. His presence at this event was unexpected. He rarely mingled in spaces designed for backroom deals and self-congratulatory speeches. When J.D. finally laid eyes on him, he understood the appeal. Alex moved through the room with ease, his presence magnetic, his confidence effortless. He was dressed impeccably, his suit tailored to perfection, but there was an air of irreverence about him, a deliberate refusal to conform completely to the world he had infiltrated. J.D. noted the way people reacted to him, how some stiffened at his approach while others leaned in, drawn to the energy he carried. Their introduction was inevitable, orchestrated by a mutual acquaintance who seemed almost amused by the prospect of their meeting. As they shook hands, J.D. felt an immediate, inexplicable charge. It wasn't attraction in the way he had come to understand it, it was something subtler, something more dangerous. Alex wasted no time in making his stance clear. His eyes sparkled with amusement as he referenced one of J.D.'s recent policy positions, his tone teetering on the edge between playful and challenging. J.D. felt the familiar urge to defend, to push back, to assert his own stance. But there was something disarming about Alex. He didn't attack so much as invite the debate, offering provocations with a smirk rather than a scowl. What began as a polite exchange soon deepened into something more charged. Their words became weapons, though neither seemed intent on drawing blood. They sparred over economic policy, over the role of government, over the moral responsibility of those in power. J.D. recognized in Alex a mind as sharp as his own, a relentless curiosity that refused to settle for easy answers. Others drifted away, sensing that this conversation had taken on a life of its own. The usual political scripts fell away, replaced by something more raw, more personal. J.D. found himself revealing more than he intended, not secrets, but glimpses of the man beneath the polished exterior. Alex, for all his cynicism, seemed genuinely intrigued. There was an intensity between them that neither acknowledged outright, an undercurrent neither dared name. It wasn't just intellectual rivalry, nor was it mere animosity. It was the thrill of being truly seen, of engaging with someone who was not intimidated, not easily won over. The fundraiser continued around them, but for J.D., the world had narrowed to the space between himself and Alex Carter. What began as a chance encounter soon became something neither of them could ignore. In the weeks following the fundraiser, J.D. Vance and Alex Carter found themselves drawn back into each other's orbit, first through the occasional pointed email, then through phone calls that stretched far beyond their intended purpose. Each exchange began as a continuation of their initial debate, a battle of ideology and wit, but as the conversations wore on, the edges softened. They spoke of the past, of ambition, of the quiet moments when the noise of the political world faded into something more personal. Their meetings became routine, though never predictable. A dimly lit bar in DuPont Circle, a quiet restaurant tucked away from the usual crowd, even the rare late-night walk through empty city streets, always in places where no one would think to look for them together. J.D. knew the risk, but he justified it to himself in layers of denial. It was just conversation. It was just a challenge to sharpen his arguments. It was just an exercise in control. But control had never been so fragile. Alex had a way of getting under his skin, of exposing fractures JD had spent years trying to ignore. He spoke about the nature of power, about how people used it to suppress others while convincing themselves it was for the greater good. He questioned JD's stance not just in the abstract, but in the deeply personal, forcing him to consider who exactly was being harmed by the policies he supported, and what it meant to stand on the side of an ideology that would never fully accept him. At first, JD resisted. He clung to the framework that had shaped his career, the belief that his convictions were rooted in logic rather than emotion. But with each meeting, Alex chipped away at the walls JD had built around himself. There were moments when JD felt something dangerously close to clarity, flashes of realization that made his carefully constructed identity feel like a house of cards in an oncoming storm. Despite his internal turmoil, JD found himself craving these encounters. It was the honesty he couldn't find anywhere else, the ability to exist, even briefly, outside the expectations that suffocated him. With Alex, he wasn't the rising conservative star, the man expected to toe the party line and speak in rehearsed soundbites. He was just himself, stripped of the armor he wore in public. But the weight of secrecy pressed down on him. Every decision was calculated, every interaction rehearsed to ensure plausible deniability. He chose their meeting spots with meticulous caution, avoided familiar places, and never stayed too long. He convinced himself that so long as no one knew, so long as no lines were officially crossed, he could keep his world intact. Alex, however, was not content with shadows. He pushed JD to acknowledge what was happening between them, to confront the contradictions that defined his life. He spoke of integrity, of authenticity, of the cost of living a life that was not fully his own. JD tried to brush it off, tried to convince himself that this was nothing more than an intellectual exercise, a temporary indulgence. But the truth was creeping closer, becoming harder to deny. The night would always end the same way, with JD retreating back into his carefully curated world, returning to his role with the precision of a man who had spent years perfecting the performance. Yet, in the quiet moments, when the cameras were gone and the applause had faded, he found himself thinking of Alex. Of the way he listened, of the way he challenged, of the way he refused to be anything but himself. And deep down, JD knew he was standing on the edge of something irreversible. The spotlight on JD Vance had never burned brighter. His name was climbing higher in the ranks of conservative politics, whispered in rooms where future leaders were chosen, written into op-eds speculating on his potential. He had positioned himself as a champion of traditional values, a fighter against the so-called cultural decay that his party decried. The speeches came naturally, the rhetoric seamless. But beneath the carefully constructed image, something was beginning to unravel. His absences had not gone unnoticed. Political advisors tracked his movements with increasing scrutiny, puzzled by late-night meetings that never made it onto official schedules, unexplained time slots where he was neither at home nor in the office. Whispers grew louder, speculation taking root in the places where ambition fed on scandal. At first, the rumors were vague, a suggestion that JD was distracted, possibly seeing someone on the side. But then, a rival campaign operative began to take a keener interest, sensing that the rising star of the movement might be hiding something far more damning than a routine affair. JD could feel the scrutiny tightening around him. Small shifts in the way people spoke to him, the way certain aides hesitated before briefing him, the way journalists seemed to linger just a moment too long before moving on to their next question. It was subtle, but he knew the game well enough to recognize when the pieces were moving against him. Every public appearance, every interview, every handshake became another opportunity for exposure. Alex felt it too. The secrecy that had once been a reluctant necessity was now a suffocating weight between them. The stolen moments had turned into tense negotiations, their time together shaped not by desire but by caution. Every meeting was burdened by the knowledge that it could be the last, that discovery would not just end them but reshape the very foundation of JD's life. And yet, Alex refused to be invisible. He had spent too long fighting for the right to live openly, to demand more than quiet corners and hidden glances. The confrontation was inevitable. JD had built a career on certainty, on the belief that choices were simple, that success was earned through discipline and sacrifice. But for the first time, he was faced with something that could not be compartmentalized, something that refused to fit neatly into the version of himself that the world expected. He had convinced himself that he could have both, that he could continue to stand on podiums denouncing the very ideals he was now questioning in private. But doubt was a slow poison, creeping into the spaces he had once protected with conviction. The words he spoke at rallies began to taste bitter on his tongue. The policies he defended felt like knives against his skin. He had spent years justifying his positions, telling himself that he was protecting tradition, that he was preserving something sacred. But now, when he looked into Alex's eyes, he saw the cost of those justifications. He saw the hypocrisy he had refused to acknowledge, the harm he had excused. His political world was closing in, and Alex was pulling away. The pressure mounted from both sides, his party, his advisors, the relentless march of media speculation. And at the center of it all, the one person who had made him feel seen was now standing on the precipice of walking away. For the first time in his career, J.D. Vance found himself truly uncertain, not of his ambitions, but of the man he had allowed himself to become. The photograph was grainy, but the damage it caused was crystal clear. J.D. Vance and Alex Carter stood too close in the dim glow of a street lamp outside an upscale Georgetown hotel. Their postures suggested intimacy, their faces turned toward each other in a way that left little room for misinterpretation. It wasn't explicit, there was no kiss, no physical touch, but the atmosphere of the image was unmistakable. The world saw something J.D. had spent months, if not years, trying to keep buried. The leak spread like wildfire. Within hours, news outlets dissected the image, each publication adding its own spin. Some framed it as a desperate smear campaign, a baseless attempt to take down a rising conservative leader. Others hinted at a looming scandal, questioning the nature of J.D.'s relationship with the well-known liberal journalist. On social media, the speculation turned ruthless, hashtags trended, theories spiraled out of control. J.D.'s phone buzzed relentlessly with calls from advisors, donors, and party officials. Some were panicked, others furious. The damage control strategy was simple: deny, deflect, dismiss. It was an easy sell to his base. There was no definitive proof, no action caught on camera. It could be explained away as a misleading angle, a manipulative attempt to twist an innocent conversation into something salacious. The machine of conservative media was already moving to frame the narrative in J.D.'s favor, branding it an attack orchestrated by the radical left to silence him. But the photo wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a fissure in the carefully constructed identity he had spent his career maintaining. Alex, however, refused to be erased. He had built a life on truth, on the belief that living openly was not just a personal choice but a moral obligation. He had tolerated J.D.'s secrecy for too long, had allowed himself to exist in the shadows of someone else's ambition. Now, with his own name dragged into the chaos, he refused to participate in the farce of denial. He wouldn't let J.D. bury this under spin and excuses. The pressure from both sides was suffocating. J.D.'s allies warned him that his future was at stake, that admitting to anything, even subtly, would mark the end of his political career. They urged him to distance himself, to issue a firm denial and paint Alex as an opportunist looking for attention. Some whispered that it wasn't just about politics. If this story gained traction, it could cost him everything: his marriage, his standing, the life he had meticulously built. Yet, for the first time, the path of least resistance didn't seem so simple. He had spent his career making choices that served his ambitions, that aligned with expectations. But now, he was confronted with a choice that was not just about politics, it was about himself, about the truth he had spent a lifetime running from. He stood at a crossroads, knowing that no matter which path he chose, there would be no turning back. The press conference was scheduled for noon. By sunrise, J.D. Vance had already rewritten his statement 3 times. Each draft leaned in a different direction, one filled with outright denial, another laced with strategic ambiguity, and the last, the one that terrified him most, the one that felt closest to the truth. The conference room inside the Senate office building was already packed. Cameras were positioned at every angle, journalists murmured among themselves, some drafting their headlines in advance. His aides flanked the podium, whispering last-minute advice, their eyes filled with expectation and desperation. They had made it clear, his decision today would not just define his career but dictate the entire trajectory of his life. J.D. had spent years thriving in the world of absolutes. His speeches were firm, his policies rigid. He had built a name on the illusion of certainty, on the idea that he knew, beyond a doubt, what was right for the country. But standing behind the podium, staring at the sea of reporters, he felt the weight of something unfamiliar, doubt. The words came out measured, rehearsed, each syllable carefully chosen to mitigate damage. He spoke of misinterpretations, of political attacks designed to distract from his work. He referenced the dangers of sensationalism, how private lives should not be weaponized. He framed the photograph as misleading, a moment taken out of context. It was the version of the statement his advisors had approved, the one that would silence speculation and solidify his standing. He did not say Alex's name. He did not acknowledge the reality that had unraveled his carefully constructed life. The questions came fast, some harsher than others. He deflected, kept his expression steady, allowed himself to slip into the well-practiced rhythms of political survival. The conference ended with the usual applause from his allies, a well-orchestrated display of support from his party. But as he stepped away from the cameras, something inside him remained hollow. Alex's number was still in his phone, the last message unopened. He hadn't responded after the photo leaked. He hadn't reached out after the decision was made. The silence was heavier than the scrutiny of the press, sharper than the disappointed looks from his few friends who had suspected the truth. Later that night, alone in his office, J.D. caught his reflection in the darkened window. The man staring back at him looked the same, the suit crisp, the posture composed, but something in his eyes had shifted. He had won the battle for his career, but he had lost something far greater. No matter how many times he repeated the words he had spoken that day, no matter how many times he reassured himself that he had done what was necessary, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would never be the same man he was before Alex Carter.